Warp fields bend space. Transporters dematerialize matter and reassemble it across vast distances. Sensors can detect a hydrogen atom at 10 light-years. In the 24th century, the United Federation of Planets has catalogued, quantified, and rationalized nearly every phenomenon the cosmos has thrown at it. Nearly every phenomenon. What the USS Enterprise D encountered near the Romulan neutral zone on stardate 47832. 1 defied every sensor array, every theoretical model, and every rational explanation Starfleet's finest minds could construct in the first 3 minutes of contact. What emerged from the collapsing subspace rupture was not a natural anomaly. It was not a Romulan incursion. It was not a temporal echo or a displaced probe. It was a shuttle, small, angular, bearing no registry, no warp signature, and no design language recognizable from any Federation database. And inside it, very much alive and already furiously calculating his next move, was the most dangerous man in a universe that no longer existed for him. His name was Lex Luthor. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. In his own world, Luthor had been many things. Billionaire. Industrialist. President of the United States. The self-appointed guardian of humanity against the existential threat posed by an alien god in a cape. He had built weapons that could wound a Kryptonian. He had outwitted beings of incalculable power. He had looked Superman in the eye without flinching, because Lex Luthor operated from a conviction so deep it had calcified into something resembling faith, that humanity's survival depended not on the charity of gods, but on the unyielding ingenuity of human minds. The LexCorp Quantum Displacement Project had been his most ambitious gamble yet, a controlled subspace bridge intended to allow instantaneous transit across vast distances without the limitations of conventional propulsion. The math had been elegant. The execution had been nearly perfect. The variable he had failed to account for was the pre-existing subspace fault line running 17 kilometers beneath his test corridor, invisible to every sensor array his engineers had deployed because it existed at a frequency no instrument in his universe had been calibrated to detect. The rupture had lasted 4 seconds. That was all it took. Now his shuttle drifted in the gravitational shadow of a star he didn't recognize, surrounded by a debris field of crystallized energy residue still sparkling from the rift's collapse, and on his console, cracked along the lower left quadrant, but functional, he was already pulling up every scrap of sensor data his damaged systems could gather. The exosuit in the cargo bay had taken the worst of the transit stress. Its kryptonite core had discharged completely, the mineral's unique radioactive properties rendered inert the moment it crossed dimensional barriers into a universe where the element had no context, no target, no reason to exist. The structural plating was intact. The servomotors were functional. But the offensive systems were dead weight until he could find an alternative power source. He noted this the way he noted everything. Clinically, without panic, filing it under problems to solve rather than reasons to despair. What he noticed next was more immediately pressing. The vessel approaching on his long-range sensors was enormous. Galaxy class, though he didn't have that terminology yet. What he had was geometry, the saucer section, the twin nacelles, the scale that suggested a crew complement in the hundreds, and the energy readings of a ship whose weapon systems were powerful enough to vaporize his shuttle before he could complete a single countermeasure. They were hailing him on a frequency his comm array had automatically triangulated. He let them hail for exactly 45 seconds, using the time to run a compression algorithm on the incoming signal and begin parsing the language structure. By the time he opened the channel, he already understood approximately 60% of what they were saying. Unknown vessel, this is Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the USS Enterprise. You have emerged from an anomalous subspace event in a restricted area of space. Please identify yourself and state your intentions. The voice was measured. Authoritative without being aggressive. The voice of a man who expected to be obeyed and had spent enough time in command that the expectation had become invisible to him, woven into the fabric of how he spoke. Lex Luthor recognized command presence. He'd spent years cultivating his own. He adjusted the calm frequency, cleared his throat once, not from nerves, but from the clinical awareness that first impressions were leverage, and responded. "Captain Picard? My name is Lex Luthor. I apologize for the dramatic entrance. I assure you, it wasn't intentional." A pause precisely calculated. "I suspect we have a great deal to discuss." On the Enterprise's bridge, Picard exchanged a glance with Counselor Troy, who was already leaning slightly forward in her chair, her expression carrying the particular concentration she reserved for beings whose emotional landscape was complex enough to require careful navigation. She said nothing yet, but her eyes told Picard everything he needed to know. Whoever this man was, whatever had brought him here, he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. The tractor beam engaged. The shuttle was drawn smoothly into Shuttle Bay 2. And in the cargo hold of a vessel that had never existed in Lex Luthor's universe, surrounded by technology he had never imagined and crewed by a civilization built on principles he would spend the next several days systematically dismantling, the most dangerous human mind in 2 universes smiled quietly to himself and began to plan. Shuttle Bay 2 smelled of recycled atmosphere and ozone, the faint metallic tang of energy systems working in close proximity, the subtle pressure differential of a contained environment aboard a vessel traveling at warp. Lex Luthor noted all of it in the first 4 seconds after the bay doors sealed behind his shuttle. He noted the configuration of the security team waiting for him. 6 officers, phasers holstered but hands positioned for rapid deployment, spread in a containment pattern that suggested standard boarding protocol rather than genuine threat assessment. He noted the architectural language of the bay itself, the smooth curves and clean lines of a design philosophy that prioritized function without sacrificing aesthetics. He noted the absence of visible corporate insignia, the uniformity of the crew's attire, the deliberate egalitarianism embedded in everything from the lighting to the spacing of the officers' positions. A civilization that had spent considerable effort erasing the visual markers of individual hierarchy. Interesting. The officer who stepped forward to receive him wore a gold uniform with commander's insignia and carried himself with the particular density of someone who had been in more dangerous situations than he cared to count, and had survived all of them through a combination of skill and controlled aggression. His forehead bore the distinctive ridged architecture of a Klingon, though the Starfleet uniform suggested a more complicated story. He stopped 3 meters from Luthor and regarded him with eyes that were doing precisely what Luthor's were doing, cataloging, assessing, calculating threat. "I am Lieutenant Commander Worf, Chief of Security. You will surrender any weapons or devices on your person and submit to a bioscan. These are not requests." Luthor spread his hands in a gesture of cooperative openness that was entirely theatrical. "Of course." He allowed the security officers to conduct their sweep, watching the readings on their tricorders with peripheral attention. Handheld devices. Remarkable resolution. He filed the technology away. "I should mention that my shuttle contains an exosuit in the cargo bay. It's currently non-functional, but I imagine your sensors have already flagged it. I'd prefer it wasn't disassembled without my knowledge." Worf's expression didn't change. "Your preferences are noted." They escorted him through corridors that confirmed everything the shuttle bay had suggested, a ship designed for long-duration exploration rather than pure military application, crew quarters interspersed with laboratories and recreational facilities, civilians visible among the uniformed personnel. Children even. Luthor absorbed this detail with particular attention. A warship that brought children aboard. Either these people were extraordinarily confident in their ability to protect them, or their understanding of acceptable risk was fundamentally different from anything he'd encountered. He was taken to a briefing room on Deck 8, comfortable chairs, a long table, a viewport showing stars drifting at low warp as the Enterprise repositioned away from the neutral zone. 3 people were waiting for him. Captain Jean-Luc Picard stood at the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back, studying Luthor with the measured attention of a man who had encountered enough extraordinary situations to have developed genuine patience for the inexplicable. Beside him sat Counselor Deanna Troi, her dark eyes carrying a quality of focused attention that Luthor recognized immediately as something more than professional interest. And at the far end of the table, standing rather than sitting, was an android, gold-skinned, amber-eyed, utterly still in the way that only something non-biological could be still, like a photograph of a person rather than a person. Luthor sat down without being invited to, crossed one leg over the other, and waited. Picard took the seat across from him. "Mr. Luthor, I'll be direct. Our sensors tracked the subspace rupture that deposited you here. The energy signature is consistent with a dimensional transit, passage between parallel universes. Our records contain several such events, though none involving an unassisted craft of your design." He paused. "Commander Data has been analyzing your shuttle's exterior configuration and the residual energy readings." "Data." The android clasped his hands on the table with a precision that was almost self-parodying. "Your vessel's propulsion technology is consistent with early 21st century Earth engineering, with several significant modifications suggesting a considerably more advanced individual design philosophy. The materials used in your shuttle's hull plating include 3 compounds not present in Federation databases. Most notably, a crystalline mineral integrated into your cargo bay equipment appears to have undergone complete energy discharge during the transit process. I have not been able to identify it." Luthor looked at Data for a long moment. The android met his gaze with an expression of polite, genuine curiosity entirely uncomplicated by the social calculations that governed every other face in the room. Luthor decided immediately that Data was the most honest person present, and therefore potentially the most useful. "The mineral is called kryptonite," Luthor said. "It won't mean anything to you. In my universe, it was the only reliable means of neutralizing a specific threat. Here, it appears to be inert. Which means," he continued, his tone remaining conversational, "that the threat it was designed for doesn't exist in this universe. An interesting data point." "What threat?" Troi asked. Her voice was careful in a way that told him she was already reading something from him and hadn't decided yet whether to share it with Picard. "An alien," Luthor smiled. "Extraordinarily powerful. Positioned by circumstance and public sentiment as humanity's protector." The smile didn't reach his eyes. "I had a different interpretation of what that meant for humanity's long-term autonomy." Picard studied him. "You built a weapon against a being who was protecting your people. I built a contingency against a being whose power operated without accountability." Luthor's voice remained pleasant. "There's a meaningful difference, Captain. Though I suspect it's a distinction your Federation may have difficulty appreciating, given that you've apparently solved the problem of power accountability to your own satisfaction." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the viewport, the stars continued their drift. Picard leaned forward slightly. "You'll be our guest aboard the Enterprise while we assess your situation and determine the feasibility of returning you to your point of origin. In the meantime, you'll have access to common areas under escort, and we'll provide whatever you need for your comfort." "And my shuttle?" "Will not be disassembled without your knowledge," Worf said from the doorway, his delivery carrying the precise weight of a man repeating something he found mildly irritating. Luthor nodded graciously. "Guest." The word had been chosen deliberately, an assertion of hospitality that functioned simultaneously as a boundary. He was not a prisoner. He was also not free. He understood the architecture of the offer perfectly. He understood something else, too. In the 40 minutes since his arrival, he had identified 7 distinct technological systems he didn't recognize, 2 crew behavioral patterns that suggested internal Starfleet tensions worth exploring, and 1 android who would answer direct questions with direct answers regardless of diplomatic inconvenience. He had been aboard for less than an hour. He was already learning faster than they realized. The quarters they assigned him were on Deck 7, comfortable by any reasonable standard, furnished with a replicator that could produce food and drink to specifications he hadn't provided but that the ship's computer had apparently extrapolated from his bioscan. The bed was Federation standard, which meant it was better than anything available in most of his world's 5-star hotels. The viewport looked out onto open space, stars fixed at impulse as the Enterprise held position, while Starfleet Command was presumably being briefed on the situation through whatever subspace communication infrastructure these people had built. He slept 4 hours. He didn't need more. By the time the escort arrived to bring him to his second briefing, Luthor had spent 3 hours at the room's computer terminal. Access limited, naturally, to public Federation databases and general historical records, nothing sensitive, nothing tactical, and had consumed more information about the political, scientific, and philosophical architecture of the United Federation of Planets than most of its own citizens bothered to retain. The Federation Charter. The Prime Directive and its 17 major amendments. The history of first contact with Vulcan, the founding of Starfleet, the Cardassian occupation of Bajorans, the Borg incursion at Wolf 359. The economics of a post-scarcity civilization that had eliminated currency in favor of a system built on the radical premise that material need, once removed from the equation, would allow the better aspects of human nature to dominate. He found the theory elegant. He found the execution naive. He found the gap between the two absolutely fascinating. Picard was waiting for him in the observation lounge, the curved room at the Enterprise's stern, its massive viewport framing a sweep of stars that would have been, under different circumstances, genuinely beautiful. This meeting had a different configuration than the first. No Worf at the door. No Data taking notes at the far end of the table. Just Picard, 2 cups of tea already on the table, and the particular quality of stillness that Luthor had come to associate with a man preparing for a conversation he considered important. Luthor sat. He didn't touch the tea immediately. "You've been in our historical database," Picard said. "Not an accusation. An observation. You gave me access. I used it." Luthor tilted his head slightly. "You were at Wolf 359. Something moved behind Picard's eyes. Controlled but present. "I was. As Locutus." Luthor watched the word land. "The Borg assimilated you. Used your knowledge of Starfleet tactics and psychology to destroy 39 ships and kill 11,000 people. Then you were recovered, restored, and returned to command." He paused. "The Federation gave a man back his ship after he'd been used as a weapon against his own people. I find that either extraordinarily compassionate or extraordinarily impractical, and I'm genuinely uncertain which." Picard's expression was steady. "Both, perhaps. The Federation believes in the capacity for recovery. For redemption. The Federation believes in a great many things that work considerably better in theory than in practice." Luthor finally picked up his tea. "The Prime Directive, for instance. Non-interference with developing civilizations. A principle so absolute that Starfleet officers are required to watch populations die rather than intervene if the cultural development threshold hasn't been met." He set the cup down. "In my universe, we call that indifference, and dress it in the language of respect. In your universe," Picard said carefully, "you built weapons against the most powerful protector your world had." "In my universe," Luthor replied, his voice carrying the patient precision of someone who had made this argument many times and had never once found it adequately understood. "I recognize that a civilization dependent on a single unelected, unaccountable being of limitless power for its survival has surrendered the most fundamental thing that makes civilization worth having. The capacity to determine its own fate." He leaned forward slightly. "Your Federation has solved this problem, Captain. You have no Superman. You have something arguably more dangerous, a collective ideology so thoroughly internalized that the individuals within it have ceased to recognize it as a constraint. You call it values. I call it a very comfortable cage." The observation lounge was quiet. Through the viewport, a distant nebula painted the darkness in bands of violet and gold. Picard was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had shifted. Still measured, but carrying something more genuine beneath the diplomatic surface. I've encountered beings who've made similar arguments. The Ferengi, who equate freedom with the absence of regulation. The Cardassians, who argue that order requires the subordination of individual will to state authority. Even members of my own crew have questioned whether the Federation's principles represent genuine freedom or merely a more sophisticated form of conformity. He met Luthor's eyes. The question isn't one I dismiss. But I notice that you frame every argument in terms of control. Who has it, who lacks it, who must be prevented from accumulating too much of it. That's a particular lens, Mr. Luthor. And lenses, by definition, show you some things clearly while obscuring others. Luthor was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to signal that the point had genuinely registered, not so long as to suggest it had wounded him. What do you think my lens is obscuring? The possibility, Picard said, that trust, freely given and genuinely earned, is not weakness. That a civilization choosing to believe in the best of itself isn't naive, it's aspirational. And that the man who spends all his energy preparing for betrayal may be the architect of the very world he fears. It was, Luthor acknowledged internally, a better argument than he'd expected. Not convincing. But better. He was about to respond when the ship shuddered. A subtle vibration transmitted through the deck plating, the kind that carried different weight depending on whether you understood what it meant. Luthor didn't yet. But Picard was already on his feet, moving toward the door with the automatic urgency of command, and through the viewport Luthor caught the brief, distinctive shimmer of a vessel decloaking. A Romulan warbird. Its hull the color of deep water, its forward profile like a predator in descent, it held position off the Enterprise's port bow with the casual confidence of something that had been waiting there for quite some time. Luthor stood, moving to the viewport. He studied the ship's lines with genuine appreciation. Whoever had designed it understood that intimidation was its own form of communication. It appears, he said, to no one in particular, that my arrival hasn't gone unnoticed. The Romulan warbird held its position with the particular patience of a predator that had already decided the outcome of the encounter, and was simply waiting for the other party to reach the same conclusion. Its hull markings identified it, to those who could read them, as a vessel operating under direct Tal Shiar authority, which meant it hadn't stumbled across the Enterprise by accident, and hadn't been in the area for any reason connected to routine patrol. It had been here because someone had told it to be here, and that someone had known about the subspace rupture before the Enterprise had finished processing its own sensor logs. Picard reached the bridge in 40 seconds. Luthor was escorted back to his quarters by an ensign who was professional enough not to run and young enough that the effort showed. From Deck 7, Luthor had no direct access to bridge communications. What he had was the ship's internal environmental systems, which were routed through the same computer architecture as the public database terminals, and which, if you understood the right queries, produced pressure differential readings across every section of the ship that, when mapped against the Galaxy-class deck plan he memorized 3 hours ago, gave him a remarkably accurate picture of where large groups of people were moving and with what degree of urgency. It wasn't surveillance. It was inference. There was a difference, and Luthor found it a useful one to maintain, at least internally. The bridge was fully staffed. The transporter rooms on Deck 6 and 24 were both active. Security had doubled its complement in the corridors adjacent to the shuttle bay. Whatever the Romulans were saying, Picard was taking it seriously without yet treating it as a crisis. 20 minutes after the warbird decloaked, his door chimed. Worf entered without waiting for an invitation, which Luthor found either culturally consistent or deliberately provocative, and decided it was probably both. Behind him came a woman Luthor hadn't met yet, human, mid-50s, silver hair cut with military practicality, wearing a uniform that carried the insignia of a Starfleet admiral on its collar. She hadn't beamed aboard from the warbird. She'd been on the Enterprise already, which meant she'd been here before the Romulans arrived, which meant her presence and their arrival were almost certainly connected. Mr. Luthor, she said, taking the chair across from him without preamble. I'm Admiral Nora Sati. I've been aboard the Enterprise for the past 6 hours, traveling from Starbase 67. I was already en route when the anomaly was detected. She folded her hands on the table. The Romulan vessel outside is commanded by Sub-Commander Valera of the Tal Shiar. She's requesting what she calls a consultation regarding the individual who emerged from the dimensional rupture. She's identified you by name. Luthor let that settle for a moment. That's impressive. I've been in this universe for less than 14 hours. The Tal Shiar has monitoring equipment along the neutral zone that can resolve sensor data our own arrays miss. Worf said, his tone carrying the particular displeasure of someone acknowledging an adversary's competence. They detected the rupture before we did. They had additional time to analyze the residual energy signature. And to identify me from it. Luthor nodded slowly. Which means they have access to information about my universe. Prior contact, perhaps, or dimensional research of their own. He looked at Sati. What does Sub-Commander Valera actually want? She wants to speak with you directly. Sati's expression was carefully neutral in the way of someone who had spent decades in rooms where information was a weapon and had learned to keep her own locked away. Captain Picard has declined to facilitate that meeting aboard the Enterprise without your consent and without Starfleet's formal approval, which I am in a position to provide or withhold. She paused. Before I make that decision, I want to understand what the Romulans would want with you specifically. What makes you valuable to the Tal Shiar, Mr. Luthor? It was a good question, and she'd asked it the right way. Directly, without pretense, acknowledging that she needed information he possessed. Luthor respected the approach even as he noted that the answer he gave would shape every subsequent interaction aboard this ship. I'm the most advanced human intellect in my universe, he said, keeping his voice entirely matter-of-fact. I have knowledge of technologies that don't exist here. My understanding of quantum displacement, the science that brought me to your universe, is roughly 2 centuries ahead of anything in your Federation database. The Romulans aren't interested in me as a person, Admiral. They're interested in what's in my head. And your exosuit, Worf added. The suit is currently non-functional. But yes. Luthor acknowledged this with a slight incline of his head. A powered exosuit using energy systems your universe hasn't developed. To a military intelligence organization, that's worth considerable effort. Sati studied him. Do you want to speak with them? The question was more interesting than it appeared. She wasn't asking whether he was afraid of the Romulans, or whether he thought it was wise, or whether Starfleet would be comfortable with the answer. She was asking what he wanted, which meant she was either genuinely trying to respect his agency or she was sophisticated enough to understand that the appearance of respecting his agency was the most effective way to influence his decision. Either way, he appreciated it. Not yet, he said. I'd like to understand what the Romulans want before I sit across from someone whose entire professional training is built around getting people to reveal things they intended to keep private. He let a small smile surface. I find it's useful to know the game before you agree to play it. Sati nodded once, rose, and moved toward the door. She stopped with her hand near the panel. For what it's worth, Mr. Luthor, Captain Picard believes you're fundamentally a reasonable man operating from a coherent, if troubling, set of principles. I've read your file from the database reconstruction data compiled. She turned slightly. I think you're considerably more dangerous than Picard does. I wanted you to know that I know that. She left. Worf followed, the door sealing behind them with a soft hydraulic click. Luthor sat in the quiet for a moment, genuinely reassessing. Sati was sharper than Picard in the specific way that people who had abandoned idealism for pragmatism were always sharper, narrower in vision, but clearer in the narrow band they chose to focus on. She was right, of course. He was more dangerous than Picard believed. But she had made the mistake of telling him she knew it. Which meant she was hoping the knowledge would make him cautious. Instead, it made him curious about what she was actually afraid of. The Romulan warbird maintained its position for 11 hours before withdrawing back across the neutral zone. Not a retreat, Luthor assessed, but a repositioning. A message encoded in movement. We know where you are. We'll wait. The Tal Shiar had infinite patience when infinite patience served their purposes, and Sub-Commander Valera had apparently decided that pressuring the Enterprise directly was less productive than allowing the situation to develop on its own terms. Luthor found this approach professionally admirable. It was exactly what he would have done. Picard had given him expanded access to the ship following Sati's departure, not freedom of movement, but a supervised tour that included the main engineering section, one of the stellar cartography labs, and a brief, carefully managed visit to the holodeck that Luthor suspected was intended as much to observe his reactions as to extend him courtesy. He had reacted with genuine interest and carefully managed revelation, showing them approximately 40% of what he was actually thinking and allowing the remaining 60% to operate beneath the surface where it was more useful. Engineering had been the most important stop. Chief Engineer Geordi LaForge had shown him the warp core with the particular pride of someone who genuinely loved what they worked on. Not performance, not salesmanship, but authentic enthusiasm for elegant systems functioning at their theoretical limits. The warp core was a matter-antimatter reaction chamber, its energy output regulated by dilithium crystals that modulated the annihilation process into a controlled, directional power stream. The energy density was extraordinary. More than sufficient, Luthor had noted privately, to power his exosuit's offensive systems if the right interface could be constructed. He had asked 3 questions about dilithium crystal resonance frequencies. The door to the observation lounge opened. He expected Worf, or an ensign. Instead it was Data, carrying a pad and wearing the particular expression of someone who had something to discuss and had calculated that now was the optimal time to discuss it. "May I join you?" Data asked. "Please." Luthor gestured to the seat across from him. Data sat with his characteristic geometric precision and placed the pad on the table between them. "I have completed my preliminary analysis of the dimensional energy signature from your arrival. I thought you might find the results relevant to your situation." Luthor looked at the pad. The analysis was dense: subspace harmonic frequencies, dimensional membrane resonance patterns, decay rates for the residual energy still detectable at the rupture site. His eyes moved through it quickly. Very quickly. He caught Data watching the speed of his reading with what registered, on an android's face, as something close to genuine surprise. "The rupture has a resonance decay rate," Luthor said, not looking up from the pad. "Which means it hasn't fully closed." "Correct. The dimensional membrane at the rupture site is still partially permeable. My calculations suggest a window of approximately 19 days before the residual energy dissipates completely and the membrane seals." Data paused. "After that point, the specific frequency required to reopen a passage to your universe of origin would need to be artificially generated. The energy requirements would be considerable, beyond the Enterprise's current capacity without significant modification. But within 19 days, considerably less energy would be required." Luthor set the pad down. "Why are you telling me this?" Data tilted his head, the gesture of genuine consideration rather than performed thoughtfulness. "Because it is relevant to your situation, and you have a right to the information. Captain Picard has not yet determined how to proceed regarding your return. I concluded that you should have accurate data about the constraints involved regardless of what diplomatic or procedural discussions are occurring at other levels." Luthor studied him. "You're giving me information your captain hasn't decided to give me yet. I am giving you information that is accurate, and that directly concerns your circumstances. I do not believe withholding it serves any ethical purpose." Data's amber eyes were entirely steady. "I am aware that this information may affect your decisions and behavior. I considered that. I concluded that you are entitled to make informed decisions about your own situation." It was, Luthor reflected, the most straightforwardly principled thing anyone had said to him in years. The android operated from an ethical framework so literal and consistent that it produced outcomes that more socially sophisticated beings would have avoided out of political caution. Data had given him a 19-day countdown because Data believed in informed consent more than he believed in strategic information management. Luthor found it both admirable and, in this specific moment, extraordinarily useful. 19 days, he said quietly. 17 by the time any return operation could be organized, Data corrected, accounting for the time already elapsed and the minimum preparation window required. Luthor nodded slowly, his mind already restructuring every timeline and priority he'd been operating under. 17 days changed the calculation entirely. The comfortable prison scenario he'd been preparing to resist was now less relevant than the question of whether Starfleet could actually get him home in that window. And whether they would choose to, or whether the institutional temptation to study an unprecedented interdimensional visitor would override the moral obligation to return him to his own universe. He already knew the answer Picard would give. He was less certain about Sati. Data, he said, keeping his voice entirely casual. Hypothetically, if someone needed to access the main engineering section after Beta shift, what would be the most efficient route from Deck 7? Data looked at him for precisely 2 seconds. I will not provide that information, he said, without any particular heat. I am principled, Mr. Luthor. I am not naive. Luthor smiled, the first genuinely unguarded smile he produced since arriving in this universe. No, he agreed. You're really not. He made his move on the third night, and it wasn't through engineering. The replicator in his quarters had been producing meals from extrapolated bioscan data, which meant the ship's computer had a detailed chemical profile of his physiology, metabolic rates, nutrient requirements, the specific molecular composition of the foods his body processed most efficiently. It was, from a security perspective, an extraordinary amount of biological information to hand an unknown interdimensional visitor. And Luthor suspected that whoever had authorized the replicator access hadn't fully considered the implications of giving a biochemist with 2 doctorates and a lifelong habit of finding leverage in unexpected places a direct window into the ship's matter conversion systems. He hadn't touched the replicator's food protocols. He had no interest in poison or biological manipulation, crude tools that created more problems than they solved and left evidence that pointed directly back to their source. What he had done, over the course of 72 hours of carefully paced requests for various materials described as personal comfort items, was accumulate enough raw isolinear components, disguised as requested reading materials on a pad that he'd subsequently partially disassembled, to construct a short-range subspace signal modulator small enough to fit in his palm. It couldn't breach the Enterprise's communication systems. It couldn't hack Starfleet databases or disable security fields. What it could do, operating at a very specific frequency he'd identified from Data's resonance analysis, was transmit a single narrowband pulse to the Romulan monitoring equipment he was confident was still positioned just beyond sensor range on the far side of the neutral zone. The pulse contained 17 seconds of data, coordinates, a proposed meeting location, and enough technical information about his own quantum displacement research to establish, unambiguously, that he was precisely who the Tal Shiar believed him to be and that he had things worth discussing. He sent it at 0340 hours and then disassembled the modulator completely, feeding its components back through the replicator's matter reclamation slot where they dissolved into undifferentiated raw material indistinguishable from normal waste processing. By 0400 he was asleep, or performing sleep convincingly enough that the biosensors monitoring his quarters would register nothing unusual. The response came faster than he'd expected. Not through subspace. Through the ship itself. At 1140 hours the following morning, during a supervised visit to the stellar cartography lab that had become part of his daily routine, Picard was methodical about maintaining the appearance of good faith hospitality, which Luthor respected. The lab's secondary display flickered briefly and resolved into a face he hadn't seen before. Romulan. Female. sharp-featured, with the characteristic pointed ears and upswept brows of her species, but carrying in her expression a quality of focused intelligence that Luthor associated with people who operated in the space between official positions and actual power. She spoke for 11 seconds in Romulan, which the universal translator rendered almost simultaneously. Your proposal is acceptable. The location is not. We have an alternative arrangement. Your escort will receive instructions. The display returned to its stellar cartography feed. The entire exchange had lasted less than 15 seconds and had been routed through a Romulan intelligence backchannel embedded in the Enterprise's own subspace receiver array, a vulnerability the Tal Shiar had apparently been exploiting for considerably longer than Starfleet was aware of. Luthor filed this information away with particular care. The Romulans had access to the Enterprise's communications infrastructure. That was a card worth holding. His escort for the stellar cartography session was a young lieutenant named Chin, competent, alert, but operating under the assumption that the interesting security challenges were physical rather than informational. She hadn't noticed the display flicker. Luthor didn't point it out. What happened next surprised him. 2 hours later, back in his quarters, his door chimed and opened to admit not Worf or an ensign but a Ferengi. Short, large-eared, wearing civilian clothes of aggressively mixed quality, expensive fabric badly combined, the fashion choices of someone who understood the price of things without understanding their relationship to each other. He carried a pad and wore an expression of commercial enthusiasm so thoroughly practiced it had become indistinguishable from genuine feeling. Mr. Luthor, he said, spreading his hands in a gesture that managed to suggest both greeting and salesmanship simultaneously. My name is Bach, no relation to the other one, I assure you, very different family, and I am currently serving as a civilian trade consultant aboard this vessel, which means I have access to areas and individuals that your Starfleet Minders find it diplomatically awkward to restrict. He settled himself into the chair across from Luthor with the confidence of someone who had been unwelcome in enough rooms to have stopped noticing. I understand you're in the market for certain technical components. Luthor looked at him steadily. Who told you that? Information is the Ferengi's most valuable commodity, Mr. Luthor. More valuable than gold-pressed latinum, more valuable than weapons contracts, more valuable than dilithium futures. Bach tapped the side of his large head with one finger. The right information, in the right moment, to the right buyer. This is the 34th rule of acquisition, and I have built my entire career on its application. He placed the pad on the table. I have access to a black market inventory of Federation and non-Federation technical components that your security detail is not aware of. I also have access to certain Romulan schematics, acquired through channels I won't bore you with, that may be relevant to your power source problem. Luthor picked up the pad. The inventory was genuine. He could tell from the specificity of the component descriptions, the kind of detail that came from actual possession rather than fabricated listings. Several items were immediately relevant to the exosuit's power interface requirements. What do you want? Luthor asked. Partnership, Bach said simply. You're from another universe. You have knowledge of technologies that don't exist here. I am a businessman with distribution networks across 4 quadrants, and a flexible relationship with Starfleet regulations. He leaned forward. In the Ferengi Alliance, we have a saying, when you find a man drowning, don't throw him a rope. Sell him one. I am prepared to offer you a very favorable rate, Mr. Luthor, because I believe that when you return to your universe, the knowledge you carry about Ferengi entrepreneurial spirit will be worth considerably more than whatever I charge you today. Luthor set the pad down. The Ferengi was simultaneously more sophisticated and more transparent than he'd initially appeared. The transparency itself a kind of sophistication, he realized, because it established a baseline of acknowledged self-interest that was in its own way more trustworthy than pretended altruism. Tell me, Luthor said, what do you know about the Romulan communication channel embedded in this ship's subspace array? Bach's expression shifted, just fractionally, just enough to confirm that he knew exactly what Luthor was referring to. "That," he said carefully, "is a significantly more expensive conversation. I expected it would be." Luthor leaned back. "Let's talk about what I can offer you that Latinum can't buy." The components arrived in a hollowed-out Tyrian chocolate puff, replicated with a specific internal cavity that Bach had apparently used for small item smuggling often enough to have refined the technique to an art form. Luthor had to acknowledge a certain admiration for the delivery method. There was an elegance to hiding sophisticated technical components inside a dessert that appealed to him in the same way that a well-constructed argument appealed to him, the forms serving the function with complete efficiency and a certain irreverent style. He worked through gamma shift, when the corridor biosensor sweep intervals were longest and the security rotation created a 12-minute window of reduced monitoring adjacent to his quarters. Not enough time to leave. More than enough time to work. The components were exactly what Bach had promised, a mixture of salvaged Federation isolinear relays and what appeared to be Romulan microfusion cells, the latter operating on an energy density principle close enough to his original power system architecture that the interface problem was one of translation rather than fundamental incompatibility. Translation was something Lex Luthor did well. By 0200 he had a functional power coupling. By 0330 he had it integrated into the exosuit's primary energy feed. The offensive systems remained offline. The Romulan cells provided approximately 60% of the output his original kryptonite core had delivered, insufficient for the directed energy weapons but more than adequate for the suit's structural reinforcement, sensor suite, and the electromagnetic shielding that was, in practical terms, the most important defensive capability he possessed. He wasn't building a weapon. He was rebuilding his ability to not be helpless. There was a meaningful difference. He noted it, as he had before, primarily for his own benefit. He sealed the exosuit in its storage configuration and returned it to the cargo bay through the internal maintenance corridor that connected his quarters to the adjacent storage section, a route Bach had identified and that the Enterprise's architects had apparently included for crew convenience without fully considering its security implications. He was back in his quarters and performing sleep convincingly at 0410. At 0900, everything changed. The ship dropped out of warp without warning, the particular lurch of an emergency stop that transmitted itself through every surface on the vessel simultaneously, followed immediately by the rising tone of yellow alert. Luthor was at his viewport before the alert sound had finished its first cycle. What he saw resolved his questions about the Romulans' alternative arrangement faster than any briefing could have. 3 ships. Not warbids, smaller, faster, the angular profile of Romulan scout vessels operating without cloaks because they had numbers and position and didn't need concealment. They had emerged from a coordinated cloak drop on 3 sides of the Enterprise simultaneously, a tactical configuration designed to eliminate the option of a clean warp escape in any direction. It was professional work. Luthor recognized the geometry of a perfectly constructed trap. His door opened 40 seconds later. Worf, fully armed, 2 security officers behind him. "You will come with me." "Gladly," Luthor said. "Though I should mention, those ships aren't here to take me. They're here to deliver something." Worf stopped. "Explain." "The Tal Shiar made contact with me 2 days ago." He watched Worf's expression process this information and produce something that combined fury with the particular professional discipline of someone who had learned to weaponize anger rather than be controlled by it. I communicated back. Not to defect, to negotiate. There's a distinction. Sub-Commander Valera has information about a Romulan operation that I believe is relevant to both our interests, and she required a sufficiently dramatic stage to deliver it in a way that her own superiors couldn't easily intercept or deny. "You contacted the Romulans from aboard this ship." Worf's voice had dropped to a register that was technically still conversational and functionally a warning. "Yes. And I'm telling you about it now rather than allowing you to discover it through your own investigation, which I could have attempted to prevent and chose not to." Luthor met his eyes directly. "That distinction matters, Mr. Worf." it should matter to you. On the bridge, Picard's voice came through the ship's comm in the controlled, precise cadences of command under pressure. The Romulan scouts were holding position. No weapons lock. No aggressive maneuver. They were, exactly as Luthor had said, waiting. He was brought to the bridge, which he recognized as a significant decision on Picard's part, either a deliberate choice to keep him visible and monitored, or an acknowledgement that whatever was happening, his perspective was relevant. Possibly both. The view screen showed the 3 scout vessels in their containment configuration, and on the secondary tactical display, the Enterprise's shields and weapons status pulsed at yellow alert readiness. Picard turned from the view screen when Luthor entered. His expression carried something new, not anger, not the philosophical engagement of their earlier conversations, but the specific quality of a man revising his assessment of a situation he thought he'd understood. Mr. Luthor. Captain? Luthor moved to stand beside the Khan without being invited. Open a channel to the lead vessel. You are not in a position to give orders on my bridge, Picard said with a quietness that was more authoritative than volume would have been. No, Luthor agreed. But I'm in a position to tell you that Sub-Commander Valera has spent the last 72 hours risking her career and possibly her life to get information to you that a significant faction within the Tal Shiar doesn't want the Federation to have. She chose this delivery method because it creates a diplomatic incident too public to suppress quietly. She needs the conversation to be on the record. He paused. Open the channel, Captain. Let her talk. If what she has to say isn't worth the security breach I created to make it happen, I'll accept whatever consequences you determine are appropriate. The bridge was silent for a moment. Troy, at her station beside the command chair, caught Picard's eye and gave the fractional nod that meant she was reading something genuine. Picard held Luthor's gaze for 3 seconds, measuring, recalibrating, and then turned to the Khan. Open a channel. The view screen shifted. Valera appeared. The same sharp-featured face from the stellar cartography display, now in full resolution, wearing the expression of someone who had committed to a course of action and had moved past the point where second thoughts were useful. Captain Picard, she said, what I am about to tell you will be officially denied by the Romulan Senate within 6 hours of this transmission. I suggest you record everything. She paused, and her eyes moved briefly to Luthor with something that wasn't gratitude exactly but was adjacent to it, the acknowledgement between 2 people who had each taken a calculated risk on the other's reliability. There is a Tal Shiar operation currently active in the Algeran system. Its objective is the construction of a dimensional rupture generator based on Mr. Luthor's quantum displacement research. Research that was extracted from his shuttle's computer during the 14 minutes it drifted unmonitored before your tractor beam engaged. The bridge processed this in collective silence. Luthor had known about the data extraction. He'd planted 3 separate false technical dead ends in the shuttle's accessible memory specifically to slow down anyone who tried to reverse engineer his work. But the Romulans had apparently gotten further than he'd hoped, which meant they had someone with genuine quantum physics expertise on their team. That was a variable he needed to reassess. How long until they have a functional device? Picard asked. Valera's expression didn't change. They already do. They've been testing it for 9 days. She paused. The first 3 tests opened ruptures to uninhabited dimensional planes. The 4th opened something else. Something that responded. The something that had responded was not, as Starfleet's initial tactical analysis suggested, a Borg probe or a Dominion scout or any other known hostile intelligence operating in the conventional spatial dimensions the Federation had mapped and catalogued over its 2 centuries of existence. What Valera's intelligence described, corroborated by sensor ghost data from 3 separate Romulan listening posts along the Algeran corridor, was a signal response of a kind that had no classification in any database, Federation or Romulan, because the entity producing it didn't exist in any dimension either civilization had previously accessed. It was, in the precise and unsatisfying terminology that data produced after 4 hours of analysis, a transdimensional intelligence of indeterminate scale operating through the rupture as a sensory aperture. Using the opening the Tal Shear had created not as an invasion corridor but as an eye. Something was looking through. And in 9 days of looking, it had learned enough about the local spatial environment to begin, methodically and without apparent urgency, making the rupture larger. Luthor absorbed this information in the Enterprise's main briefing room, surrounded by Picard's senior staff, and felt something he recognized with mild surprise as genuine concern. Not for himself. His personal survival calculus was always running, always accounting for new variables, but for the specific intellectual problem the situation presented. He had spent years in his own universe managing the consequences of power that exceeded its context. Superman was, at his core, a containment problem. An extraordinary capability operating in an environment that hadn't been designed for it, whose very presence distorted the landscape around it in ways that compounded over time. What the Romulans had done, what his research had inadvertently enabled, was create the same problem at a dimensional scale. They had introduced an aperture into a system that now contained something that would keep expanding the aperture until the system could no longer contain it. The parallel was not lost on him. "The rupture generator," Luthor said, interrupting a tactical discussion between Worf and a lieutenant commander whose name he hadn't retained. "What's its power source?" LaForge pulled up the schematic Valera had transmitted. "Modified trilithium reactor. High output, unstable by Federation standards, but the Romulans have been using trilithium variants for weapons applications since the Tomed incident. Shut down the reactor and the rupture generator fails," Luthor said. "The rupture loses its artificial stabilization and collapses under its own dimensional pressure. The entity loses its aperture." He paused. "Assuming it hasn't already expanded the rupture beyond the point where the generator is still the primary stabilizing mechanism." "That assumption may not hold," Data said. "Based on the expansion rate Valera's sensor data indicates, the rupture has grown from an aperture of approximately 2 meters to one of nearly 40 meters over 9 days. At current expansion rate, within 72 hours the rupture will reach a self-sustaining threshold, large enough that ambient dimensional pressure will maintain it without artificial support." The briefing room absorbed this. 72 hours. Luthor did the arithmetic automatically. 17 days remaining in his return window. 72 hours until the dimensional crisis became self-sustaining. The second problem consumed the first entirely, which was either cosmically inconvenient or, he reflected, precisely the kind of situation that had always clarified his thinking better than comfortable circumstances ever had. "We need to go to the Algeran system," Luthor said. Picard looked at him steadily. "That is deep in Romulan space." The Enterprise entering Romulan territory without Senate authorization would be considered an act of war under the Treaty of Algeran. The Treaty of Algeran will be considerably less relevant if the dimensional rupture reaches self-sustaining threshold. Luthor kept his voice patient. "I designed the quantum displacement architecture the Romulans used as a template. I know its failure modes better than whoever built their device. You need me in the Algeran system, Captain. And you need me there in less than 3 days." It was at this point that the briefing room's secondary entrance opened and Admiral Sadi entered, which meant she had been monitoring the briefing from an adjacent room rather than participating directly, a choice that told Luthor she had wanted to observe the discussion before positioning herself within it. She moved to the head of the table with the authority of someone who had decided the time for observation was over. "Captain Picard," she said, "I've been in subspace contact with Starfleet Command for the past 2 hours. The situation in the Algeran system has been designated a Priority 1 anomaly. Command is authorizing a response operation." She placed a pad on the table. "Under emergency provisions, the Enterprise is cleared to enter Romulan space in coordination with a Romulan vessel. Specifically, Subcommander Valera's scout, which will escort us under a temporary non-aggression protocol. Valera has apparently already negotiated with the Romulan Senate's moderate faction." She paused. Mr. Luthor will accompany the away team to the Aldrin installation as a technical consultant. Luthor noted the word consultant with private amusement. 24 hours ago he'd been a monitored guest facing potential permanent detention. The situation had restructured his value to Starfleet with remarkable efficiency. There are conditions, Suddy continued, looking directly at Luthor. You will operate under direct supervision at all times. You will not access the rupture generator independently. And the exosuit. Her eyes didn't flicker, but her voice carried a precise additional weight on the word. Will remain aboard the Enterprise. The exosuit is non-functional, Luthor said. Then there's no reason to bring it. Sati's expression was entirely pleasant. He didn't argue. The suit was functional. She almost certainly knew it was functional. They had arrived at one of those productive understandings where both parties acknowledged the other's awareness without making it explicit, because making it explicit would require a confrontation that neither party currently needed. What happened next was either coincidence or the universe demonstrating its reliable habit of poor timing. The ship's lights shifted, the subtle, instantaneous darkening that preceded a red alert by approximately half a second. And then the alert tone filled every space on the vessel simultaneously. Bridge to Captain Picard. The voice was Ensign Rowe at Tactical. We have an unscheduled arrival. Single vessel, dropping out of warp at close range. No transponder signal, no hail. A pause carrying the particular weight of someone delivering information they hadn't expected to be delivering. Captain, it's not a ship we recognize. The whole configuration doesn't match any vessel in Federation, Romulan, Klingon, Cardassian, or Ferengi databases. And sir, it's not reading as entirely physical. The sensor return is. Another pause. The computer is classifying it as partially extra-dimensional. Picard was already moving toward the door. The senior staff followed. Luthor moved with them, because standing still in a crisis was never something he'd been capable of. On the bridge, the view screen showed something that defied the clean visual vocabulary of starship design. Not a vessel in any conventional sense, but a structure of coherent energy given temporary physical form, its geometry shifting subtly as sensors attempted to resolve it into stable parameters and failed. It pulsed with a light that wasn't reflected but generated, as though the thing itself was a source rather than an object. And then, from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, a voice filled the bridge with the particular quality of sound that didn't travel through air but arrived fully formed in every listener's perception at once. Oh, this is delightful! Luthor recognized the effect immediately, the theatrical arrival, the performed amusement, the vocabulary of someone for whom power was so total that entertainment had become its primary application. He had spent years studying Superman, and Superman, for all his extraordinary capabilities, had never once sounded like this. This was something different. This was a being for whom the universe was a stage and everyone in it was, at best, an interesting prop. Data turned from his console. Captain? I am reading a Q-class energy signature. Picard closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. When he opened them, his expression carried the specific exhaustion of a man confronting a recurring problem he has never found a satisfactory solution to. Q, he said flatly. The energy structure on the view screen shifted, contracted, and resolved into the form of a man, humanoid, sharp-featured, wearing a Starfleet admiral's uniform with the particular insolence of someone who had chosen the costume specifically to irritate. He stood in the center of the bridge as though he had always been there, hands clasped behind his back, regarding the assembled crew with bright, predatory interest. His eyes found Luthor immediately. And you, Q said, with the delighted recognition of someone encountering an unexpected gift, are not from around here. Q moved through the bridge the way water moves through a space it has decided to occupy, not walking exactly, but transitioning from one position to another with the casual disregard for physical continuity that characterized beings for whom space was a suggestion rather than a constraint. He circled Luthor with the focused attention of a collector encountering an unfamiliar specimen, hands still clasped behind his back, head tilted at the angle of someone performing appraisal. A human, Q said, with the particular inflection of someone identifying something that was simultaneously familiar and wrong. Mostly. The biochemistry is standard 21st century Earth baseline, the neural architecture is within normal parameters, and yet. He stopped directly in front of Luthor and smiled with an enthusiasm that didn't reach his eyes because his eyes were doing something else entirely, something that felt to everyone on the bridge less like looking and more like reading. There's something different about you. Not your biology. Your certainty. Q. Picard's voice carried the practiced authority of someone who had learned through extensive painful experience that firmness was the only register Q occasionally respected. Whatever your purpose here, this is not the moment. We are in the middle of a time-critical situation that. Yes, the dimensional rupture, the transdimensional entity, the Romulan installation, the 72-hour window. Q waved a hand with the breezy dismissiveness of someone reciting a grocery list. I'm aware of all of it, Jean-Luc. I have been aware of all of it since before your sensors detected the original anomaly. Which means I was aware of it before any of you were, which means. He turned to face Picard with theatrical patience. I was here first. Arguably, I'm always here first. The concept of first becomes philosophically complicated at my level of existence, but the principle holds. Did you bring him here? Picard asked. The question was direct, aimed with the precision of someone who had learned that Q's games were best confronted head-on rather than navigated around. Q pressed a hand to his chest and performed a front. Bring him? Picard, I don't bring people anywhere. I occasionally create conditions that allow inevitable events to occur on an accelerated timeline, which is a meaningfully different thing, and I would appreciate the distinction being respected. He paused. But yes. The subspace fault line that intersected Mr. Luthor's experiment was not entirely natural in origin. I may have introduced a small resonance amplification that ensured the rupture propagated in a direction that deposited him specifically in your vicinity rather than, say, in the atmosphere of a gas giant, or inside a Cardassian weapons depot, either of which would have been significantly less interesting. The bridge was quiet. Luthor had been watching Q with the same systematic attention he gave to any new variable, cataloging behavior patterns, testing the architecture of the performance against the reality beneath it. What he saw was not, as he might have initially categorized it, simple omnipotent capriciousness. Q was playing a game, but the game had structure. It had a point. The entertainment was real, but it was also a method. A way of engaging with a universe that would otherwise offer no genuine challenge to a being of infinite capability. Luthor understood this dynamic intimately. He had spent years watching Superman operate from a position of such overwhelming power that the only interesting variable left was the moral question of restraint. Q had solved the restraint question by abandoning it entirely and substituting curiosity. The result was a being who needed the universe to surprise him, because surprise was the only experience his power couldn't manufacture on demand. You brought me here, Luthor said, because you wanted to see what I would do. Q turned to him with the expression of a teacher whose student has finally produced the correct answer. Specifically, Q said, I wanted to see what you would do in a universe that has no Superman. Your entire existence in your own reality has been shaped by the presence of a being of extraordinary power operating without accountability. Every choice you've made, every system you've built, every contingency you've prepared, all of it has been a response to that single variable. He spread his hands. I wanted to see what Lex Luthor does when the variable is removed. When there is no alien god to justify the weapons, no existential threat to humanity's autonomy to rationalize the methods. What are you, Mr. Luthor, when you have nothing to be against? It was, Luthor acknowledged privately, a better question than he'd expected from an entity that had announced itself by calling the situation delightful. The same question applies to you, Luthor said. You have infinite power, and you spend it manufacturing situations to observe. Which suggests that what you're actually looking for isn't entertainment. He held Q's gaze without difficulty. He had looked into Superman's eyes, which contained a kindness so total it was its own form of pressure, and he had not looked away. A merely omnipotent being with a personality disorder was manageable by comparison. You're looking for something that matters. Something that justifies existing at the scale you exist at. You need the universe to produce a problem you can't solve, because without unsolvable problems, infinite power is just infinite emptiness. Q was very still for approximately 2 seconds, which was, Luthor suspected, the longest Q had been genuinely still in the presence of a mortal in quite some time. Careful, Q said quietly. The theatrical effect had dropped several degrees. What remained was something more direct and proportionally more dangerous. The last being who attempted to psychoanalyze me from a position of biological mortality did not find the experience. I'm not psychoanalyzing you, Luthor said. I'm identifying the terms of the game. You need me to choose something. Right now. In front of you. He glanced at Picard, then back to Q. The rupture in the Algeran system is expanding. The transdimensional entity is using it as an aperture. In 72 hours it becomes self-sustaining. My return window is 17 days. If I go to Algeran and shut down the rupture generator, I solve the immediate crisis but consume time and resources that Starfleet might otherwise use to get me home. If I focus on my return, the crisis potentially escalates beyond containment. He paused. That's the choice you've constructed. That's what you want to watch me make. Q smiled, genuinely, without performance. And the choice is straightforward, Luthor said. Not because I've suddenly embraced Federation altruism, but because an uncontrolled dimensional rupture in this universe creates instabilities that could propagate across dimensional membranes, including the membrane between this universe and mine. He let that land. This isn't selflessness. It's systems thinking. I go to Algeran because the alternative makes my own situation worse. The Federation gets to feel good about the outcome. I get to go home. Everyone's interests align. He glanced at Q. Is that the answer you were hoping for? It's the honest answer, Q said, with something that might have been respect if respect were a concept Q applied to beings with finite lifespans. Which is considerably rarer than the noble answer, and considerably more useful than the cynical one. He turned to Picard. He'll need the exosuit, Jean-Luc. Fully operational. The Algeran installation has automated defense systems that will kill your away team before they reach the generator. A pause. I could simply remove the installation. But that would deprive everyone of a learning experience, and I have a strong philosophical commitment to learning experiences. Picard looked at Q with the expression of a man choosing between several equally unsatisfying options. You could end this situation immediately. Yes. But you won't. Growth requires friction, Picard. This is the most interesting thing that's happened in this sector in 40 years, and I am not going to resolve it with a snap of my fingers simply because it would be convenient. Q adjusted the collar of his admiral's uniform with deliberate finality. I will, however, ensure that the dimensional membrane remains stable long enough for your away team to reach the generator. After that, he shrugged with the elaborate casualness of someone who had already decided the outcome and was choosing not to share it. After that, it's up to him. He looked at Luthor one final time with the particular expression of someone who has placed a wager and is comfortable with either result. I find you fascinating, Mr. Luthor, Q said. In your universe, you spent your life fighting a god. The theatrical brightness returned to his eyes, carrying beneath it something ancient and entirely serious. Let's see how you do against something considerably less merciful. He vanished. The bridge lights returned to normal. The red alert tone continued its steady pulse. In the transporter room 20 minutes later, Luthor sealed the exosuit's helmet with the clean mechanical certainty of a system operating at full capacity for the first time since his arrival. The power readings were steady. The sensor suite was online. The structural reinforcement was holding at 93% efficiency, not perfect, but sufficient. Worf stood beside him in full tactical gear, examining the suit with the professional assessment of a warrior evaluating an unfamiliar weapon. "Can you fight in that?" "I can do considerably more than fight in it," Luthor said. Worf considered this. "Good." He moved to the transporter pad. "Try not to make me regret saying that." The Aldrin installation existed in the shadow of a dead star, a white dwarf remnant that provided both the gravitational anchor for the Romulan facility's orbital position and a natural sensor scattering field that had kept it invisible to Federation long-range arrays for the 18 months of its construction and operation. It was built into the hollowed core of an asteroid, its external profile deliberately irregular, its power emissions routed through the white dwarf's own residual radiation to mask the trilithium reactor's distinctive signature. Whoever had designed the installation's concealment architecture had been genuinely skilled. Luthor noted this with the professional appreciation of someone who had spent considerable effort on similar problems in his own universe, and recognized quality work regardless of its moral context. The away team materialized on the installation's outer processing level in a shimmer of blue-white transporter light that felt, to Luthor, like stepping through a threshold he hadn't fully committed to crossing until the moment it was behind him. Himself. Worf. LaForge. Two security officers whose names he had finally learned, Lieutenant Vasquez and Ensign Park, and a Romulan escort of 3 soldiers from Valera's Scout, their disruptors drawn with the practiced readiness of people operating in a facility they nominally controlled and fundamentally didn't trust. The automated defense systems activated within 4 seconds of their arrival. They were not, as Q had suggested, designed to kill intruders. They were designed to study them, to analyze biological and technological signatures before determining response protocols, which meant the first 12 seconds of contact were sensor sweeps rather than weapons fire, which meant Luthor had 12 seconds to work with before the system's threat assessment completed and the weapons came online. He used 11 of them. The exosuit's electromagnetic pulse emitter, one of the offensive systems he hadn't mentioned to Admiral Sadi, discharged in a precisely calibrated burst that targeted the installation's sensor frequency rather than its hardware, creating a feedback loop in the defense system's analytical subroutine that caused it to register the away team as already cataloged, already cleared, already processed. Not invisible. Already seen and already approved. The distinction was important. Invisible triggered secondary detection protocols. Already approved produced nothing except the quiet resumption of normal operations. Worf looked at him. That shouldn't have worked. Security systems are only as sophisticated as the assumptions of the people who designed them, Luthor said, moving forward through the corridor with the suit's sensor suite mapping the installation's layout in real time. They assumed anyone who reached this level was already a threat requiring full engagement. They didn't account for the possibility of a response that engaged the system on its own terms rather than trying to overcome it. LaForge was already scanning ahead with his tricorder, the visor above his eyes doing work that the handheld device supported rather than replaced. Reactor is 3 levels down. The rupture generator is adjacent to it. Looks like they've built the generator into the reactor's power feed directly. Shutting down one shuts down the other. What's the rupture status? Luthor asked. LaForge's expression shifted with the particular quality of an engineer confronting a number he'd hoped not to see. Bigger than the models predicted. 47 meters and still expanding. The self-sustaining threshold is closer to 40 hours now, not 72. The timeline compression registered across the away team simultaneously. The Romulan escort exchanged glances that communicated something between professional reassessment and controlled alarm. Worf's jaw set in the manner of someone recalibrating without allowing the recalibration to affect forward momentum. Luthor was already moving toward the access shaft to the lower levels. The installation's interior told a story as they descended. The story of a project that had begun with careful methodology and accelerated, under the pressure of remarkable results, into something that had outpaced its own safety protocols. The earlier levels were clean, organized, the equipment properly secured and labeled with the precise attention of Romulan engineers working to specification. The lower levels showed the archaeology of escalating urgency. Power conduits rerouted with functional rather than elegant solutions, monitoring stations abandoned mid-process, the particular disorder of a team that had encountered something they hadn't prepared for and had responded by pushing harder rather than stepping back. The fourth rupture test had produced something that responded. The teams that had been here when it responded were not here now. Luthor noted the empty workstations, the personal items still on consoles, the half-finished technical logs that stopped mid-entry on stardate displays 9 days old. He didn't ask what had happened to the personnel. The answer was visible in the architecture of their absence. They reached the reactor level and the rupture simultaneously. The physical reality of it resolving out of what the sensor data had described into something that sensor data fundamentally couldn't capture. It occupied the installation's central chamber, a tear in the fabric of space that pulsed with a light that had no color in any spectrum human or Romulan eyes were designed to process, which meant the brain produced its best approximation and arrived at something between violet and gold and the specific quality of wrongness that accompanied phenomena that didn't belong in the local dimensional framework. Through it, something watched. The entity's attention was palpable, not threatening in any conventional sense, not aggressive, but present in the way that an eye pressed against a window is present, with the particular intensity of observation that contains within it the implication of what comes after observation. It had been looking through for 9 days. It had learned the shape of local space, the signature of the technology surrounding it, the biological patterns of the beings that moved through this environment. It was not malevolent. It was patient. And its patience was the most dangerous thing about it. The reactor controls are there. LaForge pointed to a console on the chamber's far wall, 40 meters across a floor that had been partially warped by the rupture's dimensional pressure into a surface that was mostly stable and occasionally wasn't. I can shut it down from there in about 90 seconds. The rupture's gravitational gradient will increase significantly the moment the reactor begins shutdown sequence, Luthor said, running the suit's structural analysis across the chamber floor. The generator draws power continuously to maintain dimensional equilibrium. Remove the power source and the equilibrium destabilizes before the rupture collapses. For approximately 40 seconds, the dimensional pressure in this chamber will be sufficient to cause structural failure in standard Starfleet environmental suits. Data's voice came through the comm from the Enterprise, where he had remained to coordinate the operation. The exosuit's reinforced structural integrity should withstand the pressure differential, Mr. Luthor. Standard away team equipment will not. Worf looked at Luthor. Luthor looked at Worf. The arithmetic was simple and neither of them needed to say it. Get your people to the upper level, Luthor said. LaForge, walk me through the reactor shutdown sequence from here. You've never operated Romulan reactor controls, LaForge said. I've never operated most things the first time I operate them, Luthor said. It hasn't been a significant limiting factor. What followed was 6 minutes of work that Luthor would later assess as among the most technically demanding of his career, and his career had included building functional kryptonite-based weapons in a world where kryptonite had been classified as a theoretical substance by every mainstream scientific institution. LaForge guided him through the reactor's trilithium control architecture via comlink while the away team withdrew to the upper level and the entity beyond the rupture increased the intensity of its attention in direct proportion to Luthor's proximity to the generator, as though it understood, on some level that didn't require language, what he was about to do. The exosuit's structural systems held against the building dimensional pressure. The electromagnetic shielding absorbed the radiation from the destabilizing rupture. The sensor suite provided real-time feedback on the reactor's power output as he worked through the shutdown sequence with the methodical precision of someone who had decided that panic was a luxury the timeline didn't accommodate. At the moment the reactor's primary containment began its shutdown cascade, the rupture expanded suddenly. A final surge, the dimensional equivalent of a drowning thing reaching for the surface, and the entity's attention became, for 4 seconds, something more than observation. It pressed against the membrane with a force that translated through local space as a pressure wave, buckling the chamber floor, collapsing 3 structural supports, and driving Luthor to one knee as the exosuit systems screamed warnings across every readout simultaneously. He stayed at the console. The reactor completed its shutdown sequence. The rupture generator failed. The dimensional pressure lasted 38 seconds after power loss, 2 seconds less than Data's projection, which Luthor noted with the automatic precision of someone who would have found the data point interesting under any circumstances. And then the rupture collapsed inward with a sound that wasn't a sound but a cessation, the sudden absence of something that had been present long enough to register as baseline, leaving the chamber quiet in a way that felt like the universe exhaling. The entity was gone. The membrane was sealed. The installation's emergency lighting came on in the sudden quiet, casting the warped chamber floor in amber, and Luthor stood slowly from one knee with the systematic check of the suit's systems that confirmed structural integrity at 71%, sensor suite operational, power reserves at 44%, offensive systems still offline. Functional. Damaged. Standing. He opened the comlink. LaForge. Reading you? The engineer's voice carried the specific relief of someone whose models had held. Rupture is gone. Dimensional membrane is stable. Enterprise sensors confirm full collapse. A pause. You alright down there? Luthor looked at the empty space where the rupture had been. The unmarked air of a chamber that had, 9 days ago, become a window into something that had no name in any Federation database, and that had looked through that window with a patience that suggested it would find another aperture eventually, somewhere, in some universe, when the conditions were right. I'm functional, he said. 3 days later, the Enterprise held position at the coordinates of the original subspace rupture, its deflector array configured to specifications that represented a genuine collaboration. Data's dimensional membrane analysis, LaForge's reactor engineering, and Lex Luthor's quantum displacement mathematics combined into a return sequence that had taken 72 hours to design and would take approximately 4 minutes to execute. Picard walked with Luthor to the shuttle bay without an escort. It was a deliberate choice, and both of them recognized it as such. You could stay, Picard said. Not an invitation exactly. An acknowledgement that the option existed. No, Luthor said. I couldn't. He paused at the shuttle bay doors. Your Federation is remarkable, Captain. Genuinely. The principles are sound. The execution is better than I expected and worse than you believe. He looked at Picard directly. The thing beyond that rupture will find another aperture. Not here, perhaps not for a long time. But the dimensional membrane is a surface, and surfaces have vulnerabilities. Your universe needs people who think about those vulnerabilities before they become crises. We have such people, Picard said. You have scientists and diplomats, Luthor replied. They're not the same thing. Picard considered this. Perhaps. But I'd rather face an unknown future with scientists and diplomats than with men who build weapons against their protectors. I know, Luthor said. That's what makes you dangerous in your own right. He boarded his shuttle. The return sequence executed perfectly. The subspace membrane parted, accepted him, and closed behind him like a wound healing, leaving the Enterprise holding position in quiet stars, the rupture site unmarked, the universe unchanged in every measurable way except one. Somewhere in Starfleet's most restricted research archive, a file had been opened that had never existed before. It contained one name. And a warning. Live long and prosper. Hit the subscribe button for more interesting stories. Thank you for watching.